Welcome back to the Thinking Mind podcast.
Today we're going to be talking about a concept which I personally find very useful, and this is a concept derived from dialectical behavior therapy and originally derived from Buddhist thought. And this is the idea of making the distinction between pain and suffering. Now, why is it useful to make this distinction? Often people fall into the trap of feeling as though their suffering is an inevitable consequence of what happens in the external world. Events just seem to happen to them, and inevitably everything that happens may or may not impart a certain degree of suffering, and that there's a certain helplessness there. What this distinction allows one to do is to make a separation between what's actually happening, the facts of a situation, the events in the external world, and our reaction to them. And what one begins to realize is actually an enormous amount of the suffering which arises in response to an external event, be it in the form of negative thoughts or emotions, is to some degree optional. And if we begin to change the way that we mentally orient ourselves to the events which happen, we're in a position to vastly decrease the amount of suffering that we experience in relation to a given external event. So that's why it's very useful to make this distinction between pain and suffering. So if you take a practical example, if you sprain your ankle at the gym, you can immediately begin to make that distinction between the different things which are happening. So on the one hand, you'll have the physical pain from the injury, and you'll have certain other facts which occur as a result of the injury. So, for example, you may not be able to run for a certain amount of time. You may have to be on crutches for a certain amount of time. So certain things are going to happen in the external world which you can't change. Those are hard facts of the situation, and you can call that the pain of the situation. Then there's the suffering. So what does the suffering look like? That's all of the mental processes which happen as a result of the pain. So it would be a lot of negative thoughts, and that can be either directed at oneself. So for example, thoughts like, I can't believe I sprained my ankle again, I'm such an idiot, I don't know how to look after myself, I'm never going to reach my fitness goals. Or they could be similarly negative thoughts and emotions but directed towards the outside world. I can't believe I came to this gym which doesn't have the proper equipment. I can't believe I hired the same personal trainer. Why do things like this always happen to me? Why am I cursed? And you can see how these thoughts can really compound each other, and they can really start to reflect some really negative core beliefs you might have about yourself or about the world or about the narrative through which you move through life. So now we have an idea of what this distinction is and how we can apply it. It's quite easy to see how you can change your orientation towards these events. And, the mental processes, the pain part isn't optional. A lot of the things that happen to you, we can't change. But you always have the option to change your mental orientation towards what happens. You always have the option to change your response. So taking the same example of a sprained ankle, what could a different response look like? So that might look like, for example, okay, now that I've sprained my ankle, I'm going to really research this and try and figure out what happened and try and, take some measures to make sure it doesn't happen again. Or you could think something like, oh, I'm so glad I got a sprained ankle, but I didn't get a worse injury. Or you can think, oh, it's remarkable how little injuries I actually have had. Now that I've had this injury, I think I need to start taking things more seriously to prevent any future injuries from happening. So it really is just a case of changing your perspective. And it's remarkable how much of your suffering will decrease as a result of that. So let's go a bit deeper and talk about some more differences between pain and suffering. Pain, unlike suffering, is vital because when you're in pain, when you encounter pain, which of course is inevitable, you're making contact with reality. So pain is your body's way or your mind's way of telling you that something is wrong. You're making contact with external reality in a way that isn't working. Without pain, we wouldn't really be able to navigate life. You can think of pain as part of our sort of navigational system, telling us that we have to change course. So, unlike suffering, pain is something that we can't really do without. Again, suffering has it's less of a signal, and suffering is more of a narrative. And often the character of someone suffering, of a given individual suffering, will fall into a kind of pattern that they take with them across, very different events. So, for example, someone might have a narrative of abandonment where through lots of different situations that they fall into, their mental response to that situation often takes the form of, oh, I've been abandoned again. And sometimes that narrative will even influence their behavior. And sometimes it will even influence their behavior such that it's extremely likely that they'll become abandoned again. So if someone's very worried about being abandoned, they can behave in ways which are very clingy or emotionally needy. They can grasp too much when it comes to other people. And often a person's response to that is actually to move away. So you can see how, what people are most afraid of, the things that we're most afraid of, tend to influence our behavior in such a way as to make it even more likely that those things could happen. So really, suffering is pain combined with resistance to that pain. The more you turn away from and don't accept a source of pain in your life, the more suffering that will generate. And of course, that makes sense because, as we discussed earlier, pain is your body's way of telling you that something is wrong. So if you can accept that pain for what it is, you are now in a position to modify your behavior or your plan or your strategy or whatever it is, such as to now try and avoid that pain. Whereas if you resist the pain, if, for example, you keep running on that sprained ankle, you're essentially ignoring a very pertinent signal that your strategy is incorrect. That will both increase your pain and your mental suffering in the long run. So one of the ways that we decrease the suffering in association with our pain is to accept it. And a subtle point worth making is that accepting pain, accepting something that's happened to you, is not the same as approving it. So if someone wrongs you, you should accept that, but you shouldn't approve of it. You should accept that whatever happened, and you should try and make important decisions to avoid that happening again, whatever that might be, whatever applies to the situation. But what you shouldn't do is resist, pretend it didn't happen, remain in denial that it happened, or again, thoughts like, why me? How did I end up in this situation? I can't believe I ended up in this situation again. What you shouldn't do is resist it, because that will, as we mentioned earlier, that will make things worse. So what can you now do with this information? Think about different sort of negative events that have happened to you, maybe ones which you've responded to well, and ones which you've responded to badly. And try and think in those situations, which element of that situation was the pain and which element was the mental process. And in that situation, did I suffer or not suffer? How much suffering could I have potentially alleviated? What was my mental reaction to the event? And now in hindsight, maybe with some time and objectivity, how could I have reoriented myself to that event to serve myself better in the long term? And now maybe think about what you're afraid of happening now. I think most of the time people are anticipating a given amount of bad things that may happen to them in the short, medium, or long term future. And try and think, if the things I'm afraid of do happen, what's the range of ways that I can respond? And it would be helpful to make these really concrete. So even writing down on paper, pick 3 things that you're afraid of happening. And then for each event, pick 3 ways that you could mentally respond. And it's really easy to see, it's really easy to extrapolate and see how the different ways of responding to an event mentally will then shape your behavior on an ongoing basis. So I hope this was a helpful distinction between pain and suffering, and I hope this is something you can apply to your lives. I really want all the information that we give on this podcast to be as practical as possible. I don't believe that information that you can't apply in a practical sense to actually improve your quality of life is very useful. I'd also like to say I'm really grateful for all the feedback for the podcast that we've received for the past few months. It's been really appreciated. If you want to give any feedback, if you have any suggestions of what you'd like covered on the podcast, you can email us at podcast@maudsleyllearning.com. I hope everyone's well, and I hope everyone's coming up with their different ways and strategies of dealing with what a strange time we're living in. And I'll see you all next time.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.